So this week we're going to talk about functions. What class is this? What language are we teaching?
Programming with Python.
Python. All right. What software are we using to code our?
Idle.
Cool. So you guys should be halfway through the quiz for this week.
Oh, that's cool.
If you paid attention to that. All right. You guys do have a quiz that'll be Thursday. So more than likely, we may or may not need the class on Thursday. You should be able to do the quiz. Yes.
So, is it quiz our homework for this week? Or?
Yeah, no homework. Just a quiz.
Ooh.
Just a quiz, open book, open note. You got an hour to complete it, and you have to complete it once you start. All right. So, in talking about functions, you guys are already familiar with some functions that we've used thus that are built in for print, input, len, etc. You can note that they're functions because they'll have this with the two parentheses at the end, right?
Oh.
If there was a dot in front of this, it would be some kind of method on some variable that you were doing that on. But these are your functions, all right? Now, a function is literally just a mini program within your main overall program. So, for example, if we have def hello and it prints howdy, howdy, hello there, and we call that function 3 times, you're going to end up with howdy, howdy, hello there, howdy, howdy, hello there, howdy, howdy, hello there, right? The idea behind a function typically is that one containerizes everything that you're wanting to do for that particular function. And two, it allows you to eliminate repeating your code. So you guys may have already noticed this in some of your homework assignments. You seem to be repeating the same thing over and over and over. And it happens as you start programming. Instead of you having to copy and paste and tweak one little variable, you should be writing with functions so that that number of lines of code would be condensed down. And every time we wanted to print hello there in our program, it would go up and execute this code. So if you have this in a script, this code will not execute until it's called upon. All right. So it always goes at the top of your script, and then you would call it somewhere in the script, and it would go back to that piece, run this code from top to bottom. Once it's done running this function, it goes back to wherever it was in the program and keeps running. Okay. If there's a couple pieces to a function itself, you're going to see something like this is what would be outputted, right? Over and over and over, because we told it to call 3 times. In which case, how could we do this same thing here? Where we wouldn't have this many lines of code. How could we condense that down to 2 lines of code to do this? You guys learned this last week. Yeah, you could do a for loop with I in range, right? So for I in range of what? 1 to 4, 0 to 4. Yep. Any one of those, right? As long as you're going to get it to repeat 3 times, then you would put hello as a function inside that for loop. And the first time it runs it, it would do hello. Next time, hello. Next time, hello. The I in that case is irrelevant, right? So what am I talking about? Let's just build that up real quick. So if we took this and we created our little function, def hello, and we say print howdy, print howdy, print hello there, right? And today we have hello. Nope, not like that. Like that. And we end up calling that 3 times. To fix that or to shorten that code, even for that, we could say for I in range of 0 to what? 3, right? That would give us 0, 1, 2, 3. Give us 4, 0, 1, 2, right? O up to 3, but not include. So that gives us our 3 there. We would just say hello like that. All right. We can get rid of this, and it's going to do the exact same thing. Now, note that only saved us 1 line of code. But if you had multiple lines of code that would be doing, or you're repeating that multiple times, you could obviously save multiple lines of code going through. All right. So to create a function, we need a definition statement. So we have def as a keyword. Then we need to have whatever the name of the function we want. And you need to add 2 parentheses on the outside of that, followed by a colon. Then we would indent our next line of code, and this would be whatever block of code we wanted inside of it. So we could have our prints, we could have our while true statements, we could have whatever else we would want inside of that. All right. We can also pass variables into that, which are called parameters. So for example, instead of just saying and calling hello, maybe we want to call hello with some kind of name. So let's do something like Jason. And up here, we're going to say name. And then in here, we would put something like, something like that, right? And so we're going to pass in a name, and then we're going to use that name inside of our function. So in this case, I pass in Jason, and it's going to go ahead and pass that into the function here, at which point it's defined as the word name or the variable of name. And then we can use name anywhere inside of our function in place of whatever the user put in here. All right. So if I change this from Jason to Ben, then all of a sudden, when this prints it out, it's going to print Ben. So let's look at this here. Where's my syntax for IN range? There you go. So you get the howdy Ben, and you get that chunk 3 times because we had the for IN range. All right. So again, you can have this with no parameters, in which case you just put nothing inside of there. If I put name, that means I must pass something into the name when I get in there. So if I just call hello here, I'm going to get an error that says it has 1 required positional argument name. All right. If I want it to be optional, where sometimes I want it, but sometimes I don't, then I would say name equals nothing. And that way, if I pass something in, it works. If I don't pass something in, it doesn't work. So if I run it again, notice everything works just fine. If I happen to decide to pass in Ben, then it will go ahead and put Ben in there. All right. Everybody kind of see how that works? So if you just have name in here, then at that point it becomes required and somebody must pass in that name inside of there. If I have equals to nothing, then by default it's equal to nothing unless I specify what it is when I call it. All right. You can have multiple items that we come in here. So we could have name, age, eye color. Why not? And we may change something in here and say print something like person stats for whatever reason. That's what we're going to call this, right? And we could say print hello and whatever their name is. And we could say, you said you were something like that. You said your eye color was Okay. So now when I call hello, or in this case, we're going to change this and call person stats. And let's get rid of the range because we don't want to show that now. So if we do person stats, and if I try to run this, it's going to fail because it's going to say you need 3 positional arguments, meaning name, age, and eye color are required in order to call the function person stats, right? If we look at print, for example, you guys are familiar with that. Notice that it has arguments in here as well. We can set arg, sep, end, file, flush, but notice how those have equal signs on them, which means they have default values. All right. If we don't pass anything, what does it do? Prints an empty line, right? And the reason it prints an empty line is because it ends with the /n, which is the new line character. That's the reason it prints an empty line when you do an empty print. Right. So in our case, we're going to call person stats. We need to give it a name. We need to give it an age. I'm not actually 50, but it works. And we'll give it an eye color. Okay. Now, if we run this, pull this down here at the bottom where you guys can see it. You can see it prints it all out exactly the way we wanted it. Now, we probably want something like there and there so that it prints nice and clean. You guys will want to do that from here on out. Make sure your homework assignments are clean, punctuation, spelling, grammar, etc. Make sure it's all nice and clean. You said you said your eye color. Okay. Now we could collect this information and then run this if we wanted to. So we could say something like while true, print what is your name? And in this, we're going to game name equals an input. All right. And then we could go on to try to check if that name is real. In this case, we could just do a simple check if name. In this case, we could do the len of name is greater than what, 3? I guess 2. Because the smallest name that would have 2 letters is what? In the English language. What name has 2 letters?
BJ.
BJ would work. Any other names? What's up? Junior? Yeah, you could do that. Or Al or anything else in between there, right? So we're going to check to make sure that name is greater than 2 characters. If we wanted to set an upper limit, we could, but for now, we're just going to say what it is. If name is greater than that, then we will go ahead and break, and that will set the name. All right. So now, instead of this, we would pass in that name into this function. We could write another while true, and this time we could say, what is your age? Right? Then we game an age. We gather an input. And we could say if what? Int of age is greater than 0, right? Last I checked, unless you're undead, you can't go negative. And what is the upper limit? There you go. Then we'll go ahead and say break. If not, it'll just keep them in that loop. So we could say something like else print that is not a valid age. Please try again. We could do the same thing up here on this name. We could do an else and do a print. A name requires more than 2 characters. Okay. Then we want to gather an eye color. So while true, print What is your eye color? And we could do an age, or I'm sorry, eye color is what we said. Something like that. What kind of check can we do there? There's a bunch of different checks, right? So if eye color equals blue, or eye color equals brown, or eye color equals what's other eye colors?
Silver.
I don't know who you're hanging around, but you might not want to hang around that person long. What else we got? Hazel. Okay. Green. You can see it's kind of a pain to do a check in one line for every single eye color, right? We have ways of fixing that later on. But for now, this is what you guys know. So this is how we could clean up that input from that user. And so if that is one of those options, then we can go ahead and break, else print you did not type a valid eye color. Please choose from the following.
Is it possible just set the input as whatever they want it to be? So you wouldn't have to go through and write all that? Like there wouldn't have to be necessarily a specific valid eye color?
You could, but the whole point now is we're trying to clean up input from people.
Okay.
If I put in giraffe, that's not a very good eye color.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's you're trying to fix it from people messing stuff up at this point. So, and there's better ways to fix it later, but here's where you start to try to do a little bit of sanitizing. So we could list all the valid options: blue, brown, silver, green, hazel, I think is what we said. Yep. Something like that. Okay. And so once we have that, we can then pass in age, and we can also pass in eye color at this point. Now notice I named these the same as what the function is assuming they're going to be called, but you do not have to do that. All right. Because once we pass those in, I can literally put anything here, just like we had before, right? We had 50 in blue. But if I want to actually pass in age or something like that, I can do that. And we're going to talk about that here in a second, what that means. For now, just pass this in so you can see it. Eye color. All right. So let's run this. First line of code, it's going to ask for our name. And it's printing hello, Jason, and I don't know why. Let's go back. I have no idea how I got that. Let's try it again. There we go. All right, what's my age? 50. What's your eye color? Blue. And it comes back with our little output that we asked it to do, right? So code-wise, it ran this while true first. It skips this, right? Here, we're just defining a function. In other languages, you may call them routines. We're defining a function up here. It's going to run this while loop, and this while loop. Because I gave a valid input, it worked. But if I said A, and it says the name's requiring more than 2. Notice how it spit it back and made me ask it again. So now I'm Jason. What's your age? I say ASDF. It's going to crash because it can't do a calculation to see if you typed in a number. Not yet, anyway. So if I do Jason, if I say -2, it's going to say it's not a valid age. If I say I'm 200, you could say that's not a valid age and go through, right? So 50, ASDF, not a valid eye color. Choose from one of the following. We say green and it goes. All right. So now you guys have some tools in order to make your project a little bit cleaner, or in this case, your homework assignments as you're going through. All right. Now, if I wanted to call name and age and eye color all over again, somewhere down in the middle of the project, well, then I have to recopy and paste this code, right? And so the idea behind a function is we would create a function to do this. So if we said def get name, right? And inside def get name, we have this content. And then down here, we're going to say def get age. And this is the age function. Here, we're going to do a def get eye color. We're going to move this into here. Now, this will print the results. But anytime I want to call these individual functions, I could do that. So I could do something like get name, get age, get eye color. And this is where the program's really going to start. So we call this our main program, right? And then once I get all that stuff, it's going to run the person stats and be done with the program. So if we run it, nothing changed. It's just now going to be going after those individual functions to get the stuff in there. Get eye color. Oops, I did a capital C. Something like that. All right. This is important because later, if you're going to rerun this get name, say you're building a character map for some game, right? And you're always going to be asking for a name, and then you're going to ask for another name. You don't want to have to copy and paste that code multiple times. Now you can just run the get name function, and it's going to do the same code every time it asks for a name. And once you build out sanitization, you're going to know that it's always a clean name that you're going to get out of there. So you can copy and paste these at the top of your individual function or your projects, homework assignments, midterm, whatever. And you know that it's always going to be clean input coming in from that side. You already designed how to get a good name or how to get a good age or eye color, etc. Again, there's better ways to do this, and we'll learn that here next week. Okay. But that brings us to the variable name. So you'll remember when we run this in the main code in the onset of name, age, and eye color, right? When we put this inside of a function, this variable eye color is only valid inside this function. Okay. So we have the concept of local variables and we have the concept of global variables. When I run this in the main program, it's considered a global variable. So if I set my name equal to Jason, right? And then I run this program, it's asking for a name and I type in Sam, I need an age and I need a blue. Notice that age is not defined. And this program crashes. That's because it doesn't know what age is. Okay. Yes, we defined age up here, but this only lives in the middle of this function. Once this function ends, any variables we create in here are gone. And I cannot access variables inside this function on the outside. Okay. So to store this, we would have to say something like name equals get name, age equals get age, and eye color equals get eye color. Now, when I run this function, it's going to store whatever comes out of this back as age, which means in my get name, before I break out of this loop, I need to say return name. And what that will do is return that name back to here and store it in the main function. Okay. This is a global variable. This name up here is a local variable. We happen to name them the same, but it doesn't really matter. All right. You can access global variables from inside of a function, but you cannot access local variables in the global scope. Does everybody understand that? Okay. If they're defined on the outside, you can access them on the inside. So when I say name equals get name, that is not the same as this name. It's going to gather an input and return it back, store it in this variable. Right. So there's times that you want to reuse these naming structures. There's other times you may not want to because it'll cause confusion for you. If I want to edit this outside name, I then have to use what's called a global statement inside my function in order to edit that. So if we look at our homework or our book here, it's going to do all the little things that we just been talking about, right? So name in this case is we define, call, and pass an argument. We can return a value. So instead of me breaking out of that function, I'm now returning whatever they typed in back to the original call. So that's called a return statement. By default, it returns nothing, right? So if I tell it to print the name, it'll print a name, but by default, it won't return anything. All right, so you can see those numbers there. You also have what's called the none value. We can ignore that. There's keyword arguments in a print statement. We'll cover that here in a little bit. This is what I want to get to, is global and local scope, all right? Local variables cannot be used in the global scope. We just talked about that. So if I say eggs is equal to 31337, I call the function spam. Spam goes up, it prints this here, and I tell it to print eggs. I cannot print eggs. And the reason is eggs is defined inside spam. I don't have access to it. You can also not use variables in other scopes. So for example, I go back to my code here. I cannot get eye color from this function inside the age function. Does that make sense? I can't go between two functions. Only thing I can do is access the global side, and I cannot access the local from the outside. Okay. It's a little trippy at first, but once you get it down, it's not too bad. Now, you can read those. So if I say eggs equals 42, and inside my function, I say print eggs, it will go ahead and print 42 for that, right? When I call this function, it's going to print 42. Then it's going to print 42 down here. You can name them the same. So for example, eggs equals spam local, bacon equals eggs equals bacon local, etc. Ignore that. That gets a little confusing. If you want to modify that global variable, so say I have something in my function or my program here, and I'm going to say class equals Python. If I want to change this class, which class is a bad name, by the way, let's call it class name. If I want to change this variable to something other than Python, I then have to edit it. So if I come in here and I say def change class, note that I'm not capitalizing the first character that comes out of here. In functions, you shouldn't do that. Yes.
I ran the code for the person stats thing. And it asked for all the variables and put them in it, read them right, but then it just put in none for all the like your age is none, your name is none.
Okay. Let's good call. Let's see what runs. So you probably have the same thing I got here. Let's look. What's your name? INF360 and green. There you go. So that none type and the reason this is doing that is because it's doing it on
I put it in the person stats function to turn everything to a string.
Right. The reason it's doing that is the first one on name, we actually returned a name. So we need to go back here to this break and do a return age. And on this one, we need to do a return eye color. Then it will actually return something. By default, it returns nothing, right? And it's actually a value called none. And none has a placeholder with a capital N-O-N-E. That's actually a value, and it just means nothing. All right. By default, that's what a function returns. So if we specifically tell it to return this age, name, and such, then it should function as you would think. So Jason, 50 and green, it would print it out accordingly.
Wait, sorry. Can you explain again what return does?
So return is going to say, what do you want me to give back to the main program? So here we collected the age, but then we break out, we don't do anything with the age, right? We don't print anything. We don't do anything. It just returns back to the main project.
So you should always put your returns under your ifs, right?
Not necessarily. Just somewhere in your function, you would need a return if you wanted to return back out of that function. You can break if you wanted to, because the whole reason this is failing now and it wasn't before is because of the way we are calling this down here, right? When these weren't functions and I just called while trues, a break worked just fine. But the moment we give them inside of a function, that function either needs to return something or it needs to crunch something, print something to the screen, and move on. In this case, we're gathering input from a user, so we want to return something back from the user. Yeah.
If you return something, you have to assign it to variable.
That's what the variable you're returning back here. Yes, on this side, yes. If I return like a name, I need to go ahead and set some variable over here. But this could be whatever variable I want. It could be ASDF. This could be something else. It does not need to match what's inside the actual function. Yeah. Yep. Whatever. Yes. So when you pass that into here, then whatever you set over here has to match down here. Great. Okay. So we have this class name and we want to modify that class name. So def change class name. And to modify that, we can't just say class name now equals math, right? And then return class name. If we did this and run it, whoops, let's do something that actually shows this. So let's do, I'm going to comment this out for the time being here. And I tell it to print class name, right? When we run this,
How did you comment that out?
notice that it just shows Python, right? And it should because it's just taking this and printing that there. To comment out, you highlight this code, go to format, and then comment out region up at the top.
That's cool.
Okay, but we need to call our little function that we had there, right? So change class name. And that should change the class name to math. And we're telling it to return that, but you'll notice nothing changed, right? Again, the reason it's not doing anything is this class name is totally different than this class name. This is a global variable. This is a local variable. As long as we're using this variable inside this function, it will be equal to math. For example, if I print class name inside this function, it's going to print Python for the first one because it does it here. Then we call our function down here. And it's going to call math because that's where this print is up here, right? If I put another print down below that function, you're going to see Python math Python. Does everybody understand what's going on there? So in the beginning, class name is equal to Python. We tell it to print. Okay. We then call our function up here called change class name, in which case class name is now equal to math. We tell it to print. We go ahead and print it and it shows math. We go back out to the outside global scape and we tell it to print class name. It is still Python as set here. And that's the difference between local and global scope. All right. If I want to modify this one here, then what I need to do is come up here and use what's called a global statement. So global class name. What that does is grab the variable name from my main program, the main chunk out here, brings it into this local scope. Now I can modify it however I want, print it out, but on the outside, it's going to show that reflection as well. So once I run this, you'll see that now it's Python when it first starts. Then once I call that function, it changes it to math, and it is permanently changed to math from there on out. The key is I have to call global class name. So instead of returning these, for example, if we didn't want to return those, we could have something like name equals nothing. Age equals nothing. Eye color equals nothing. And then inside these functions, we would just call those global variables. So global age, age is now that, and we can go ahead and just break, do a global name. That will set the name, and we can break out of that loop. Same way with eye color. And then you can come back here and set that to break as well. Now that we have those variables, you can actually run this down here. We don't need to set and call those functions, although we still want to. We would do something like get name, get age, and get eye color, right? Something like that. We run this. Oh, let's ignore this stuff that we were doing up here for the demonstration. So let's run our function here, our program. It's now has the name is equal to nothing, age is equal to empty string, and eye color is empty to an empty string. It's going to then call get name. So we scroll up here. It's first going to pull that variable name that we had down here, and it's going to allow us to modify it. So if I say Jason and I say 50 and I say blue, it's going to print it out accordingly. Notice that we're no longer returning something from here. We're actually just breaking out of this because we decided to modify a global variable as opposed to returning something back to the main program. So some of you that learn in other languages, C, etc., you always have to declare your variables ahead of time, right? This you don't have to do that, but if you choose to do that, then you can use those variable names inside of your functions as you see fit. So this is handy that say you have something that you want to carry all the way through your program, you're probably going to define it as a global variable at that point, right? Then inside any function, we can call that into our function. So here where we say, what is your age? We could say comma plus name plus question mark. And now when it asks that question, it pulls name from the actual global variable, right? We're not modifying it, so I don't have to say global name inside of here. But if I want to access that name from here on out, I can just call name inside of my function. It's going to see if there's a global name of that, and if there is, it will go ahead and dump it in there. So in this case, I can now utilize that inside of here. Everybody see how that works? The global, local can be a little tricky, so play with it, practice it, etc. If I wanted to modify the name inside this get age, I would have to come up here and say global name. As long as I don't type that, I can never change that global name. So that's a good thing, right? Say once I gather the name from them, I don't ever want them to change the name, at least not in a function that's not designed for the name. So I'd never type in the global name part. Now, the key to making this work, this is a huge midterm question that everybody misses if they don't pay attention. The only way this works is I use the global statement and then I use the variable name that I'm wanting to bring in. All right. If I just type global, nothing happens. I have to give it a variable name to bring in. All right. Yeah. No, bring them in on their own line. It would probably technically work. But much like the imports, PEP 8 is wanting you to put them on their own line. Yeah. All right. Anybody have any questions on this global local stuff? Like I said, practice it, read through here. This guy does a really good job of explaining how this works with very, very simple examples for you guys to learn from. Okay. They're very, very good on that side. Yeah, absolutely. So my main program starts by defining these three variables, but setting them to empty strings. then I could go ahead through here. I could set them to empty strings. I could set them to none if I wanted to by default. Either one's acceptable. They are two totally different things. One is an empty string. The other one is the value of none, which is an actual data type.
I am all messed up.
We bounced around a little bit.
What?
I said we bounced around a little bit.
A little bit.
Now, the only thing you can't do is you can call a function from within another function. So if I said def get stats, right? And inside get stats, I'm going to call these three. And then down here, I say get stats. So get stats is going to run, which comes up to this function and then starts calling the other functions inside of it, right? If I run this, it works the same way as we had it work before. All right. Sometimes it'll throw a fit if it doesn't know what this gets name means because it wasn't defined ahead of it. That makes sense? Sometimes it'll throw a fit like that, but in this case, it's not. So this can be handy that if later on when we get to object-oriented stuff, you would structure it in a similar fashion. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about, which is great because it will help us out a little bit, is exception handling. So for example, if I have a function called spam and divide by, then I'm going to return 42 divided by divide by. In other words, divide by is whatever number I pass into this thing, right? Once it hits an arrow or an error, I get different types of errors. So for example, this one is a 0 division error. I can't divide by 0, right? If I look back at my code, at one point here, I had an error. This is a type error. I cannot concatenate strings and non-types. If I scroll up, this was a name error. Age was not defined. Name error, eye color was not defined. All right. This one was a value error. Invalid can int. In other words, I typed in ASDF. I cannot try to convert that to an integer. So this is a great one. Let's look at our age function inside of here. And if they type in anything other than a number, it's going to crash. What we can do now is use what's called a try and accept. So we're going to try to convert it to a number and run our code. But if that accepts, we can either accept on a very specific error, like 0 division error, or in our case, the one we're interested the most is value error, or we can do an accept catch-all, in which case it'll catch on any exception that comes out. So let's just stick with any exception. In this case, notice some of you guys are doing this where it's int and you're wrapping the whole input in an int. That's not the best way to do that because the moment they type in something, your code's always going to break, right? So instead of doing that, do your int down below here where we are actually doing the check, right? Int age is greater than 0 and less than 115, but we can put this in what's called a try block. And what that will let us do is try to see if this code runs. And if it does not, we'll do an except here. And in this exception, we're going to print something like that is not a valid number. Right? And then it's going to start this while loop all over again. So now if I run this, now I have a name of Jason. Whoops. Sorry. Jason. If I type in ASDF, instead of it crashing, it's going to say that's not a valid number. The reason we know it's not a valid number is because we tried to convert that to an integer, and ASDF does not convert to an integer. Therefore, it's going to print this exception and start the loop back over. So now you have a way of checking to see whether or not they're typing in a valid number. All right. And you can use try and accept on any block of code. So at the very beginning, we can try to run whatever we want to run. And if there's any problems in it whatsoever, it will hit the exception. If you only want to catch on certain exceptions, like here we did a zero division error, then you may want to print an error that's specific to that type of error. So for example, we may say something like you did not type in a valid number, or you can't concatenate two different data types. Check your data types. You can actually write those exceptions to yourself. Okay. In my case, in this code, we just did a catch-all except, but we could also catch on a value error, right? And we know it was a value error from back here. Let me scroll up. Right there, it was a value error. So if I run this again, and I do a JSON and ASDF, it still functions like we would expect it to. But if I change that from a value error to a zero division error, I say JSON and I say ASDF, now the program will crash because this is only going to accept on a zero division error and not the one that we actually need. We actually want a value error, or don't define which one specifically it is, just do a catch all of except. All right. So at this point, moving forward, you guys should have ways of sanitizing your input. At the very least, wrap it into try and accept. Try to get the code from the user. If you can't convert it to a number or something else, give the exception, tell them that's not valid, keep them in a while loop. So from here on out, to sanitize your inputs, always put it inside of a while true loop, right? Present whatever the question is, gather the input from the user, storing it in a variable name, and then run your checks against it. If, elifs, whatever you may want to do to check and see if this is valid input. If there's a chance that they could break the code by typing in, for example, ASDF instead of numbers, then wrap that inside of a try and accept so that if this code fails, it will give this exception. Clear as mud?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Let's see here. You're going to have a couple different programs here to play with. So there's one here called Zigzag, which is kind of fun. Let's see here. What else do they have? And there's your summary. Now you're going to have a chunk of these practice questions. Run through these and see if you can answer those. All right. Down here on the practice projects, from here on out, they're going to give you guys projects to see if you can write a function called collats that takes in parameters and does that. This is very similar to like homework, right? Meaning you can write these challenges. If you don't quite understand it, see if you can actually write it. So for example, here, add a try and accept to detect whether a user types in a non-integer number. We just did that, right? And now you will raise a value error, pass it to a non-string. So if I say int puppy, it's going to catch on the clause. So essentially, I just showed you how to do this one. And that is why we now have a way of doing input validation. Input validation, sanitization, same terminology. Practice with the functions. That the functions are a huge piece of Python, meaning you're going to want to write a bunch of different functions. So for example, in your midterm project, you have to write your own functions. And it needs to be more than def print hello, print hello. You know what I mean? I want to actually see you interact and use something inside that function. It could be something simple like this, where you're gathering a name. It could be something more advanced where you're actually passing in variables and printing them out on this side. Or maybe you're crunching something with those. So for example, before you guys were calculating what their age was in 5 years and what it was 5 years ago, right? In the very first homework assignment. You could write a function that would do longer calculations out and then return that information back to you. Anytime I wanted to run that longer calculation, I would just call that function. It's a great way to compartmentalize your projects. As you guys noticed, it got really long with a bunch of while loops, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to read. You don't know where to go. Here, I know if I want anything to do with getting age, I just jump up to this function and there's my block of code with get age. So it's a way to modulize your
Just make it
project.
easier to look at.
Yep. Later on, you can actually kick those to another file and import them. And then it's like using the print function or the random function.
And
The
you just
random int.
always have it and you just tweak it, right?
You got it. So when we do import random up here at the top, that's literally just a random.py is the name of the file. And all these functions are defined in there. One of them is called randint. And that has parameters that you pass in between 1 and 10. And it gives you a random number between 1 and 10.
So by the end of the course, we're going to be able to go back to separate things and files we have and just use those over again.
Yep.
That's
Or you can break it up, because if your project gets super long, like here, I've got 58 lines of code in no time, right? You may have hundreds of lines of code. It would make sense to break it up into little files on your, by the time you get to your final project. As a matter of fact, that's required in order for you to hit the logging requirement in the final function. That's a long ways to go. 13 weeks from now.
So what is that, like 26 class periods?
Roughly, if you include the ones where I let you work on your own work. So. Long ways to go to get there, but you guys are, this is a big start. And understanding functions, this is the part that everybody starts to miss on the midterm project, is they forget they have to write their own functions. Even though it's clearly defined in the rubric, they forget they have to write their own functions. So I want to see examples of your own projects. I want to see examples of loops. I want to see examples of other stuff that we have yet to cover. Yeah.
So with that said, that you have to use your own, you have to write your own functions. Can you take functions you've written beforehand and import them in, or no?
You can, they should be in your project. So your midterm project is just one flat file, but you may have these functions copied and pasted at the top because you utilize them in that function. Yep. Anybody else have any other questions on functions? If you get lost or you need more, like I said, do the little quote unquote homework down here at the bottom, the short program, and do this other one down here where it actually does this here. Challenge yourself with this one. Okay. I know nobody likes to do extra homework, but little stuff like this will actually help you
Make your life
learn how to
easier
write
later.
code. Yeah. Especially by the time you get to the midterm. But always run through these little questions, tell your, see if you know the answer. If you don't know the answer, then you should probably go back and look at that chunk. If you want the answers, you can always go over here and get the actual answers, by the way. If you go back to the table of contents, scroll down to the bottom and get answers to the practice questions, you can get your answers to the practice questions. All right. Same way with the homework assignments, these running programs, they'll show you how to pull stuff up in there. Anybody else have any other questions? All right. I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see who else is online. Spencer. Yep, that's right. Let's see. That's all I got, Spencer. I'm going to stop the recording.